usual, but I mean, we used to that. We used to that. Window capture. Okay, we're using the right mic. Desktop audio, there isn't it. Wait, speak tunic.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Desktop audio is working. And then I have to throw the camera in here. I don't know why my camera does this every time. I don't really understand why. No, you can't get mod, bro. It always does this. And I don't really understand. I've been trying to figure out why, but I don't know why. It just will not like show up immediately. Try to unplug it, plug it back in. Oh, that's not the camera USB, that's why. I just don't understand why it doesn't work. Video. Test video. I mean, it works on Discord just fine. So that's what always confuses me. Maybe I need to turn this onto this so that I can, like, when Discord's open, it can play here. I just, like, have never figured this out. It will just work at random. Weird. Oh, okay. Now it's up. Maybe I just have to click that button every time. I have no idea. Okay. Let's do this. Okay. All right, we're streaming. For the word. Let me pull up the verse. Okay. Okay. And we'll just go and go from here. All right, welcome everybody to the stream finally. We're just going to continue with Matthew. We've been doing this for, wow, many times. Over a year we've been going through Matthew. There have been long breaks, but at random times, but we've been continuing, and we're already in Matthew 13, and we're hoping to be continuing on your way to sorry, I got distracted for a sec. Continuing on our way to finish through the book of Matthew, maybe by the end of this year, who knows? Probably not, given that we're only doing 2 verses today, but I think that this is an important little parable. So, you know, we've been talking about the parables in Matthew 13. Jesus has been outlining what the kingdom during the church age, which is called the mystery form of the kingdom very often, would look like. And 2 of the parables that we've covered, the longer ones, have been explained to the disciples. This is to understand that Jesus, while speaking in parables, specifically, purposefully, and even prophetically, to hide the truth, to obscure it from people who did not want it, or who had already been rejecting, to better be said. And he also did want his disciples to understand. So he's been explaining them to them. He had said that the disciples understood all things at the end. If you look later in the chapter, it says, verse 51, have you understood all these things? They said to him, yes. And Jesus said to them, therefore, every scribe who has become a disciple of the kingdom of heaven is like a head of a household who brings out of his treasure things new and old. So it has been confirmed. Awesome. Oh, Purell might come, but he's setting up a new gaming system, so he's gonna a new system. Yes, he'll make it if he can. Anyway, point being, Jesus wants the disciples to understand these things, and so we have a couple of the explanations. We don't get an explanation for the mustard seed parable, but given the fact that we have the entire scripture and we understand God and his character and we understand the other parables, we can understand this one pretty well as well. So the lesson of this one, let me read the verses. 31 and 32. He presented another parable to them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field. And this is smaller than all other seeds, but when it is full grown, it is larger than the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and nest in its branches." That's the parable. And here's the idea, I think simple enough. Small things can have profound results. Mustard seed indicated as the smallest of seeds, but then becomes the largest of plants, and we'll talk about all the meaning of that as we go. So, the disciples, we know, believed at this point that Jesus was Messiah. They believe he was the anointed one. That's what the word means. And so they were expecting and anticipating this kingdom. They expected it to come according to the Old Testament in glory and power and in many cataclysmic judgment events and blazing displays. So they really were excited for this. That's why even in Acts, I always reference this, they say, well, will you now bring the kingdom? Even after Jesus ascended, because they still did not fully understand this mystery form of the kingdom. So they struggled with him as the Messiah when these expectations weren't being met, when actually the opposite seemed to be the case. In fact, things had, of course, seemed very exciting when you take John the Baptist, and the idea of that and all the stir that he was creating. People were flocking out to him in the wilderness to be baptized, to hear his message. And then he said, I must decrease and the Lord must increase, or Jesus must increase, the one who's coming after me. And so it really thought I was going to reach this climactic, glorious point. But then now it's 12 guys and this guy who's being maligned and blasphemed and persecuted, in a sense, wandering around the wilderness. So their expectations of what this kingdom would be are not being currently met. And then Jesus starts talking about how he must die. So this is going to make it harder. And we see this later in Matthew 16. We see verse 21, 16, just jumping ahead for a moment. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed and be raised up on the third day. So his death. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid it, Lord, this shall never happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you're not setting your mind on God's interests, but man's. Good to see you, Nighthawk. He always comes about 30 minutes after we start. It's always a joy. Welcome to the study. So point being there, number one, the disciples did not understand his death. They did not accept it well, and they even spoke against it. And then Jesus says in this passage, get behind me, Satan. Basically, you're really being a mouthpiece for Satan right now. Why? Because you're trying to keep me from the cross, even though it doesn't make sense for you. It's being used for evil, your words. Why would that be bad? Because God's purpose was for Jesus to die, right? Look what it says later. Then Jesus says to his disciples, this is the next verse, if anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Verse 26, for what will it profit a man if he gains a whole world and forfeits his soul? And here it is, or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? And I think that following phrasing is important, because what it's basically saying there is a soul that's damned when it comes to the end of days. What does a man have to give in exchange to get that back? Right? How can you save your own soul from judgment? What could you barter with to revive that soul? Now, of course, the message is primarily, hey, take the gospel seriously, because your soul is more important than things. But the underlying message is, well, something needs to be there for you to buy back your soul, because you can't do it yourself. There has to be something greater than yourself that can provide that way. So I just thought that was important. There's a look into how the disciples might have felt during all this. So the final kingdom has not happened yet, and Jesus is explaining this mystery form. And we know that the wheat and the tares are growing together from the last parable, that we cannot be the one to discern that judgment. And so the question in the disciples' mind is probably, how can this kingdom, so the current church age, the kingdom we see now, and we know we see it because we walk into churches and we see in the churches, first of all, in themselves, various churches and pastors and preachings and messages that are all over the place. Some are definitely devoted to God. Some are definitely false, and all in between. And then even within the churches, we see people false and true. Everybody who listens and goes to church probably notices it in their own church, or at least in surrounding churches. You experience people in your church who walk away, even if they've been there for years, who definitely do not live for God, even though they attend, who might even be hard to tell if they're really believers, because they seem so externally like a Christian that you couldn't even perceive it. And this is all over. We hear this in all the false prophecies, the people using the name of Christ for their own gain, and even sounding good and gaining a lot of following. But of course, the church is full of the tares as well as the wheat. I think this is best expressed in two types of current problematic forms of the gospel today, or false gospels. That would be, of course, charismatic movement, which is millions deceived by that. And then the Catholic system. Rome has, of course, deceived many as well by their false gospel. And so both of those elements of the church, which as far as the external earthly church, the external community of Christianity, whatever you want to call it, they're huge parts. But the majority of people in those systems are tares. But they're a part of the broader church. And to many eyes, you can't perceive who is what. I know a lot of Catholics who I would identify, who identify with Catholicism, that I identify as Christian. I'll be like, yeah, that person lives like they know the Lord maybe better than I do. Right? In the sense where I certainly need to work on things like joy and whatever. But, but then of course there's people within the system like Catholicism or other systems that you're like, clearly they do not understand the gospel. And so the question in the disciples' mind is, how is the kingdom going to survive all of this evil? How is it not going to get choked out by falsehood? How is it not going to get choked out by people's inherent base desire, which is to sin and to think of themselves? And the disciples had it harder because they had 12 people. They were there in John 6. When they were the remaining 12, maybe there were a few others scattered from the 5,000. They were the remaining 12, effectively, of 15,000 who walked away. I mean, you think you get the bread of life story and you think, okay, well, I mean, a lot of them are just seeking him for food, fine. But you think at least a couple thousand would have listened and be like, oh, okay. His words seem to be pretty important. I'll stick around. It seems worth the cost, but it's 12. And at the end, I believe at the end in, at his ascension, you had 120. So you have this very small group of people, even at the end of Christ's movement. And now you ask, the disciples would be asking then, how is it going to survive? How is the kingdom going to grow and not be choked out? So these next two parables, the mustard seed tonight, and I guess next week the leaven, are talking about the kingdom's final victory, the final overcoming of the kingdom of God. Of course, for some, they believe in the end times that the kingdom of God will, in this church age, slowly overcome the world, and the kingdom will just move in to the quote-unquote millennial kingdom of Christ, where the church will rule and the gospel will rule on this earth. Or simply, one of the other positions, premillennial, of course, that Jesus will come back and just set up his kingdom, and so many will be saved, and then the kingdom will be ruled by Christ on earth. Whatever you see it as, the kingdom is going to triumph soon. But it's going to be a slow go. And for this mystery form time, you're going to have the false and the true moving together. The power of the kingdom is in these parables. The mustard seed explaining more the height and the extent, right, of the kingdom, how broad it's going to be across the world, while the leaven will explain more the depth, the working from the inside out nature of the kingdom. So verse 31, to go back to it. He put another parable before them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field. So a farmer plants a crop. He plants a crop of mustard, right? It's a type of seed. And this crop produces two types of things that are pretty useful. It's good for flavoring. I mean, we know it because I believe mustard sauce comes from a manipulation of the mustard seed. when it's grown. And it also makes oil. And oil, this particular type of oil could be used for many things back in the time. So it's a very useful plant, right? And it was the smallest of all seeds, but it grew into the greatest of all herbs, that even birds would come and nest in it. That's what it says in 32, so that the birds of the air come and make a nest in the branches. This is actually true contextually and botanically, I guess, to the time. Mustard plants, even though the seeds were so tiny, they grow about 7 to 8 feet, and sometimes also 12 feet to 15 feet. And that 12 feet is tall. 12 feet is a definitely identifiable tree. Right. And so this bush that would come from this particular seed, and you could consider it a bush more of like, because it was in the herb family, right? It was a plant grown for eating. It wasn't actually a tree the way we define it today, but the word tree is used here in the passage because of its tree-like characteristics, right? How so? Tall, lots of branches. The branches would even firmen up. They would harden for certain times of the year. That's why birds were able to come in and nest in the branches. So one of the interesting parts about this, though, it's about plants in general, I'd say, but especially the mustard seed, is the lack of apparent connection between the small seed and the large result. Because in general, it's amazing how a small seed turns into such a large plant, like an acorn turning into a tree is incredible. But it's even more counterintuitive that the smallest seed would turn into the largest plant of its kind, right? As it's called the least of all seeds. Now, I'll stop for a second just to point out something quick, and that is that this particular passage has been attacked. And the reason it's been attacked is because critics trying to find contradiction in the text or so on and so forth have pointed out that there is actually a smaller seed than the mustard seed, and it's the wild orchid seed. They're actually smaller seeds, just I guess by size. And so they say, oh, Jesus didn't know, or he lied to appropriate to the culture, accommodate them in some way. So either way, he's wrong, right? Either he was ignorant of something in his supposed creation, or he lied to the culture because he wanted to appropriate to what they currently knew. This is a valid critique at first, but it's not a substantial one. It doesn't really hold up, and here's the reason why. The word here used for plants or seeds here is lakanon in the Greek, and this particular word for herb, it refers to a garden vegetable grown purposely to be eaten. Right, not just any wild plant, meaning that the context in which Jesus has set up when it talks about these larger than all the garden plants or smallest of all seeds is contextual to plants being grown for the purpose of eating. Right, herbs is a fine term, not just any plant. Which means that it is the least under this context. To this day, it's still the least under this context as far as the plants grown for eating. In about, I think it was the 16th century, when tobacco started being grown, tobacco seeds are technically smaller, but tobacco seeds are not grown for eating. You can intake them, but not in the edible sense. Even chewing tobacco, you have to chew and spit out. So even that possible fly in the ointment, not valid. It's still the smallest seed to this day of smallest seed as far as plants you'd grow to eat. I think it's important because it's a thing that comes up. It's a particular type of supposed inaccuracy, and it's just not valid. Becomes a tree is also attacked. A little bit, but again, like I said, you look at the properties of this plant, even though it's not a particular species tree as we define them today, 12 feet, birds can come and nest in it. The branches harden, as I mentioned before, in parts of the year. They're literally lodging in it. Birds, the word is used to make their home in, right? They literally set up nests and lived in this tree, and even were able to use the tree specifically by itself to actually for the most part, live as far as not just shelter, but food as well. So I'll also point out here that Jesus is pulling on a Jewish proverb. It just happens that the proverb is accurate botanically, I guess. But even so, even if it was not, I think you could still make a completely sound argument that Jesus is speaking proverbially. The mustard seed was actually used very common in the Jewish time, a proverb for something small. They would say things like, a tiny breach of the Mosaic law was a defilement as small as a mustard seed, or a blemish or a spot on an animal the size of a mustard seed. These were common expressions. We use them today. Like we say, strong as an ox or wise as an owl or stuff like that. So we do this all the time. It doesn't mean that owls are the wisest things ever, or that owls are comparatively wise to the person in question. It just is an expression to illustrate something. Jesus wanted to communicate a message to a group of people. He didn't want to teach them botany. Now, again, I believe botanically he just happens to also be accurate in this case, because Jesus is wise and probably knew that people in this generation would be like this. But it's it's not even close to important to bring that up. Anyway, so what is the teaching here with this? Right? The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed. It's the smallest of all seeds, but when it has grown larger, it will be larger than all the garden plants and become even a tree, and even birds will come in the air and come and make their nests and lodge and make their home in the branches. What is he saying here? He's saying the kingdom's going to start small. Well, of course it does. We've seen that in this gospel so far, because Jesus called 12 insignificant men from Galilee. They were probably between 14 and 18 years old. That's the understanding. And the reason, I forget exactly why the reason was, but I've seen a lot of teaching on this that puts their age around that time. It does make sense when you read carefully through the Gospels and consider all the very immature moments with the disciples, very odd moments, that outbursts that you may not expect to see from if they were 30, like James and John having their mom, or at least their mom by her own choice, coming to Jesus to say, will you put my two sons at your left and right hand in the kingdom? I mean, just very odd scenarios if they were a bunch of 30-year-old men. But the kingdom's going to start small, right? It started with a baby, right? It started with Christ born as a baby in an insignificant town, and then insignificant 12 group of fishermen and other similar types were chosen. It's an imperceptible start. I mean, this was hard to see. I mean, we even kind of struggle to see it today. We can be discouraged in certain areas and places where the gospel is not too prolific, and we can even have a hard time seeing it. But especially then, how hard it was to notice the kingdom, because as a spiritual nature, with such a small group of people. But it has a potential for a very, very large tree. And again, like I said, even only about 120 when he ascended were his followers. And so this, for a while, this idea of smallness, this starting small characteristic, just continued. But the kingdom is going to be big. And I have a bunch of references I think would just be encouraging for us to read that will point out some natures of the kingdom that is coming that I think might provide just a useful understanding. So let me turn to them. Revelation 7 is my first one. So again, to keep in mind, the kingdom started with 12 people, 12 immature boys, and started with even before Christ as a baby, making a difference slowly in his time, encountering much rejection, being blasphemed. Like Jesus said, foxes have holes and rabbits have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head, right? There wasn't even a place for the Son of Man to exist. What's up, Bobby S? I mean, there was very, very little going for the quote-unquote kingdom back in the time. And then, of course, we move to today. We see today the kingdom it's very substantial. A lot of false Christianity exists, but a lot of true Christianity exists. And Christianity, or the message of Christ, has had a profound effect on the world, whether it be simply just positive indirect effect because of the things of Christianity blessing the world, or if it simply be direct effect of actually saving souls, it's had a major effect. A lot of countries and nations that were built on Christian values, in some sense, usually prosper, built on Christian laws, usually keep order longer. You see this across the world. And then you look at Revelation 7, 9 to 17, and this is about the tribulation period. And again, whether it's the premillennial 7 years or a longer period of time in a more figurative sense, either way, this is in the future. Verse 9, after these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude, which no one could count, from every nation and all tribes and peoples and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, and palm branches were in their hands, and they cried out with a loud voice, saying, salvation to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. And all the angels were standing around the throne and around the elders. Skip down a second. Then one of the elders answered, saying to me, these who are clothed in the white robes, who are they, and where have they come from? Talking about this countless multitude. I said to them, I don't know. Well, that's paraphrasing. He says, my Lord, you know, which is saying, I don't know. And he said to me, these are the ones who have come out of the great tribulation, and they have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. For this reason, they are before the throne of God, and they serve him day and night in his temple. He who sits on the throne will spread his tabernacle over them. What is it saying? There's going to be a countless, innumerable number of believers coming from the tribulation. Countless. How much more over the rest of history? I mean, the kingdom is reaching an incredible size, starting from 12 people. All right, move to Psalm 72. And some of these Old Testament passages would actually ring in the disciples' heads as they thought about what the nature of the kingdom would be. Psalms. Finding in the Bible can be tough. Okay. 72:8, may he also rule from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. Let the nomads of the desert bow before him, and his enemies lick the dust. Let the kings of Tarshish and of the islands bring presents. The kings of Sheba and Seba offer gifts. And let all the kings bow down before him. All the nations serve him, for he will deliver the needy when he cries for help, and the afflicted also, and him who has no helper. This is the nature of the kingdom. Even the kings will come and bow down before God, before Christ, the kings of the world. Well, this must be quite a universal kingdom. I also cited, I think usefully, Revelation 21. Just briefly, and basically I cited it because it describes the New Jerusalem, which I just want to point out. The city is laid out as a square, and its length was as great as the width. And he measured the city with the rod, 1,500 miles. Its length and width and height are equal. And he measured its wall, so on and so forth. 1,500 miles length, width, and height of the capital city of heaven, the final kingdom, of course. 1,500 miles would be about 2/3 of the size of the United States, 2/3 of the distance of the United States. So take that distance and go in width, height, and length, and you have yourself just the size of the capital city of heaven. Well, at least in size, that's also a huge kingdom. You go to Isaiah 54, it looks like. Let me get there. Enlarge the place of your tent, stretch out the curtains of your dwelling, spare not, lengthen your cords and strengthen your peg, for you will be able to spread abroad to the right and to the left, and your descendants will possess nations and will resettle the desolate cities. Basically, make your tent bigger because it can't even contain the size of this kingdom. You look at Zechariah 8:23. I think this one is also very fascinating. More of the personal size of the kingdom. By that I mean people. Zechariah, you might know this passage. Zechariah 8. So many peoples and mighty nations will come to seek the Lord of hosts in Jerusalem and to entreat the favor of the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, in those days 10 men from all the nations will grasp the garment of a Jew, saying, let us go with you, for we have heard God who's with you. Who heard God is with you. I mean, what does that mean? It's just a picture. The overcrowding nature of how many people are fighting to see Christ and to be in his kingdom is overwhelming. And that's all I'll quote for now. So basically, big idea, kingdom started small, it's going to be big. Not only big, it's going to be so big it's going to engulf the world. right? Even before the Lord destroys all things and recreates the new heaven and the new earth, and we live in that eternal state forever. In the millennial kingdom that's coming, the kingdom of Christ will engulf the world. So what are the birds? What are the birds? We understand seed starts small and it grows really big, smaller than all the seeds, and then it grows bigger than all the plants, so that the birds of the air come and nest in its branches. So what is that? It could represent anything. I think it's really just to describe how big the tree is. It's a way to describe it, because if something can make its home in something, then it must be big. But here's interesting regarding the birds living there. I think there's some interesting parallels. I saw a couple in my study just to help you understand maybe how the Bible or the disciples might have received this. Ezekiel 31. And this is a couple examples where a nation is being described as a tree. So just listen. Whom are you like your greatness? Behold, Assyria was a cedar in Lebanon with beautiful branches and forest shade, and it's very high, and its top was among the clouds. The waters made it grow, the deep made it high, with its rivers continually extended all around its planting place, and set out its channels to all the trees of the field. Therefore its height was loftier than all the trees of the field, and its boughs became many, and its branches long. And the birds of the heavens, verse 6, nested in its boughs, and under the branches all the beasts of the field gave birth, and the great nations lived under its shade, so beautiful in its greatness and in the length of its branches. What is it pointing out? Assyria, and of course, it has negative things to say about Assyria later, but Assyria used to be a huge nation, so big that it literally engulfed other life. Other life could literally rest in, be protected by, be provided by from this giant nation of Assyria. So this idea of a tree and other things coming to live in it and lodge in it would indicate that it reaches a size that can literally provide for other life. You look at also Daniel 4. The vision of the great tree. Nebuchadnezzar has a vision, and it has a tree involved, and he explains it to Daniel. The tree grew large and became strong, and its height reached to the sky, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth. Its foliage was beautiful, and its fruit abundant, and in it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it, and the birds of the sky dwelt in its branches, and all the living creatures fed themselves from it. I was looking at the visions in my mind as I lay on my bed, and behold, an angelic watcher, a holy one, descended from heaven. He shouted out and spoke as follows: chop down the tree and cut off its branches, strip off its foliage and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts flee from under it and the birds from its branches, yet leave the stump with its roots in the ground. And then Daniel responds later. The tree that which you saw became large and grew strong, whose height reached to the sky and was visible to all the earth, and whose foliage was beautiful and its fruit abundant, and which was food for all, under which the beasts of the field dwelt, and in those whose branches the birds of the sky lodge. It is you, O king, for you have become great and grown strong, and with your majesty has become great and reached to the sky, and your dominion to the end of the earth. And in that the king saw an angelic watcher, a holy one, descending from heaven and saying, chop down, so on and so forth. He explains the rest. Basically, what's being pointed out here is this idea of nations or entities being so big that the birds and the beasts can get shade underneath or lodge in it. And what we are being described in Ezekiel and Daniel, kingdoms of Assyria, kingdom of Babylon. And these other passages have other meanings pertaining to them, but the point is, this is going to be the nature, in the one sense, of the kingdom of God. It started small. It started with very little, and it's going to grow to where everyone can come and be provided by through it. Thus will be the nature of the final kingdom. And I think this is true. I think we see this. Wherever Christianity flourishes, we have those nearby climbing into those branches. This can happen in the micro sense and the macro sense. The last example I'll give, the last reference I'll give, that's often understood. I'll do a comparison of the lesser to the greater, often done in the Bible, so you understand just once more the nature of the birds nesting. Here's the benefits of Christianity in the micro sense. 1 Corinthians 7:12. But to the rest I say, not to the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he must not divorce her. And a woman who has an unbelieving husband, he consents to live with her. She must not send her husband away. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified through her believing husband. For otherwise your children are unclean, but now they are holy. What is it saying? First of all, it's not saying to marry a non-believer. This is if you already are in a situation where you already are married to a non-believer, right? Obviously, some people become Christians after they're married. What this is saying is when you're married to a non-believer and then you are a Christian and they don't want to leave the marriage, because it says if they do, you just let them go, then the Christian spouse will bring blessing on their family and on the non-believing spouse. The non-believing spouse will be a bird in the tree, lodging in the tree, receiving the benefits of that union because God is involved, because there is a Christian in the union. Right? And in the same way, in the macro level, where Christianity is flourishing, where believers are flourishing, the church is flourishing, there will be benefits around by the nations and the peoples around who maybe even aren't believers, who are climbing into the branches of the kingdom to experience that. Sometimes it's the experience of particular false followers themselves gaining the benefits of the kingdom through their activity because of the kingdom's flourishing. And sometimes it's simply just disinterested people in the kingdom who are just nearby and experiencing the benefits. America is a good example. Of course, America has millions of problems and a lot of sin, and so does every nation, but there is a flourishing in this Western world and in places like Europe as well that is not in other places where the gospel is just dark and non-present, like third world countries in India and things like that. Not that those places are worse than America, just simply that the gospel has not produced as much there. It's not reached as many areas there, and so there's been less overall general benefit, even to the people who don't know God in those places. So yes, I think that's the final understanding. So I believe that sums up this parable. I think that means for us that I think we can get discouraged when we feel like we can't find any Christians. I mean, I was in Boston for 5 years, and the amount of Christians was very few. The amount of even general basic understanding about God was so little, and it can be discouraging. I mean, where are the Christians? No one. I just kind of accepted it at a certain point. No one believes God. No one believes God, and it can get a little bit of a bitter, cynical outlook on things because I'm expecting very few to really, really chase God. And that is the nature of things, right? Narrow is the way that leads to life, and few who find it. But there's Servo coming in right at the end. Good timing. But we can say that this is the nature of the kingdom, and it's growing, and it will grow so big one day it will engulf the entire universe and then bring us into the final kingdom, of which it's only the Lord and his people. And it started much smaller than it is today with a few people. So I think that's, in a sense, comforting. And so I'll pray now. Lord, thank you for this time to spend in the Word. Though it be shorter tonight, it was still an exciting time just to learn about another couple of your words and understand the things you are teaching and the understandings you are giving to us that are either encouraging or sobering. And today it's both, understanding the movement of the kingdom, but also that it will prevail. And so I pray that we keep those things in mind, and it will guide our joy and guide our continual reliance on you, even when the world is very disconcerting, and that we see you in all things, even when they look bleak, Lord. Thank you. Amen. Okay, questions, comments? Do we understand that?
I actually have a comment
Sure.
on this verse in general. This is actually the verse that is commonly used. Like it's like one of the verses that's used as like biblical justification for theosis, which I don't know how much you know about that, but it's a pretty exclusively Orthodox concept. But I should just add that one of the interpretations of this, like literally the 31 to 33 specifically, is that there's obviously part of it is for faith entering a person's soul, and then that's like growth of virtue, but also that the soul will become godlike in a sense, and then can receive even angels to that extent. That's at least that's the belief of the Orthodox Church. Is one of those justifications. So I thought I might add that
Interesting.
as an extra.
I don't know if that's, I don't know where that might be in the text, but I'm confused about what are they exactly saying?
Like about what? Like you got to be specific there. 'Cause there's a lot.
Can you describe what theosis is for everybody, and then explain exactly what you think they're drawing from this passage?
Theosis, under the Orthodox interpretation, is the ability for man to, it's an eternal process. There is no end to it. It's an eternal process of man becoming like God, because we were made in the image of God. So the idea is that through Christ we can become like God again. And one of the ways, and that's like literally like all sorts of things. But there is one distinction that the Western churches don't make, that the Eastern ones do, that makes that possible and not heretical. Because if we can't become like God, because only God is God.
Correct.
But the Eastern Church makes the distinction between God's essence and his energies, which is basically the energies are what we can comprehend as humans, like what we can see, what we can experience, just literally everything that we know. Like the God we know is God's energies. And then the transcendent part that is above human knowledge is his essence. And in most Western churches, they combine both of those into God's essence instead of making the distinction. So theosis is saying that we can become godlike in the sense that we can adopt God's energies. We cannot adopt his essence because it's unknowable and unreachable. So that's that idea. But this verse particularly is used a lot to justify this, because it is the idea of, and I know obviously the language here is pretty specific, but it's like an interpretation or like an extra meaning. Like it's not like the pure meaning, but it is an extra, interpretation. That as least of the seeds, which is as a result of the fall of man, that we can become a tree, so that the birds of the air come and nest in its branches. And then, as you brought all that up, and then the kingdom of heaven is like a leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of meal till it was all leaven. And so there's some language in there that does imply a growth of humanity past our, eternally fallen state, for, or whatever. Not eternally, but you get the idea. So I'm just saying that this is a passage that's used a lot as biblical evidence of theosis.
Yeah. I tend to agree with the idea that when we're okay, so one of the things the Bible talks a lot about is becoming like Christ. We want to be like Christ. We want to imitate Christ, right? As Paul imitate Paul, as Paul imitates Christ. All these different wordings used to talk about being like him. That is referring really to his righteousness. Now, we're going to have that righteousness in heaven because we're going to be glorified, right? Justified and then glorified. That's the final step in the golden chain of redemption, as people say. But and it would logically follow that if we're going to spend an eternity in heaven, we're certainly going to become a lot more like God during that eternity than we were at the start of it. Right? There's certainly going to be some aspect of growth, learning, experience. We're going to become more like God in heaven. I agree with the distinction. We will never become the essence of God, but we will adopt a lot of the characteristics that humans could of God. That would just make sense, right? That's why heaven's an eternity, because we can never truly understand God fully, but we're certainly going to understand a lot more about God 3 trillion years in than we will at year 1, obviously. So I think that I think that there's a sense in which that's true. I do not see that in these verses. These verses,
I'll
Jesus.
give you the bigger ones. There are bigger ones.
But hang on a
just
second.
One like itty bitty thing,
Let me respond to this, and then I'd be happy to take the other bigger ones for a sec. These verses, Jesus. So when we read the scripture, I mean, I feel like I repeat myself on this millions of times. When we read the scripture according to the context it's in, the intent of the authors, the broader context of the chapters, and the intent of the speaker, and what purpose is trying to be communicated. And clearly from this chapter, it is just, there's no doubt that what Jesus is trying to do is explain the nature of the mystery form of the kingdom. He's trying to talk about the kingdom in the current state that it is, right? Now that Jesus has come, but he has, of course, is not here to set up the kingdom yet, just to die, right? What is the nature of the kingdom of heaven in this time? And all of these 7 parables are directly accurate to everything that happened to the disciples and in the church age that we exist in now. Everything. And so this parable squeezed in the middle here, the mustard seed, is very clearly talking about the nature of the kingdom's growth. I mean, it's very plainly stated in its parable nature, right? You have a small seed and it grows even into a very, very large tree. And the birds of the air come nest, which mirrors some of the other passages about kingdoms growing and being like trees that the birds come nest that we read in the Old Testament. The leaven, which we'll talk about next time, right? Put into flour. Till what? Till the whole bit of flour, 3 pecks, whatever that is. I guess I'll know next week. Whatever amount that is. That whole bit of flour is affected by the tiny bit of leaven put in. Okay? Well, I guess you could try to apply this to this individualistic Christian becoming like God in the eternal state, but there's just no context for that here. When he says he's talking about the kingdom of heaven is like, right? The kingdom of heaven is like. Now, if you look at the other parables before this parable where he says the kingdom of heaven is like, the kingdom of heaven is like, what is clearly the nature of those parables? Well, the kingdom of heaven right now, right, in this church age to where we still have evil and good. Okay, so if the mustard seed is talking about the individual growth of a Christian into God, or maybe the kingdom growth in the eternal state of Christians becoming God, or whatever idea that is, which again, I still ascribe to a good part of that, then why would these other parables earlier on be clearly talking about the earth now where you have evil and good? You have tares among wheat, right? You have 4 different soils and their particular explained responses to the gospel. So I don't see that in here, but I'd like to see those other verses because I do agree with the general idea.
Right. So I'm using a physical Bible, so it might take me a bit to get to them. But 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 4 says that, or we should actually go back to 3. It says, divine power has given to us all things that pertain to life and godliness through his knowledge of him who called us, through the knowledge of him who called us by glory and virtue, by which we have been given to us exceedingly great and precious promises, that through these you may be partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is the world through lust. Okay. Another 1 John chapter 3, verse 2. Get to that. 1 John chapter 3, verse 2 is, beloved, now we are children of God, and it is not yet been revealed what we shall be, but we know that when he is revealed, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is, and everyone who has this hope in him purifies himself just as he is pure.
We'll go there in a second. I just want to read on Peter. Seeing that his divine power has granted us to do everything pertaining to life and godliness through the true knowledge of him who called us by his own glory and excellence. For these he's granted us his precious and magnificent promises, so that by them you may come partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world by lust. It would come down to what I mean, and again, I'm not at all rebuking. I don't know if rebuking is the word, or disputing is the word. The idea of theosis. I think it would just the details of it come down to what it means to be a partaker in the divine nature. Because partaker in the divine nature could really just indicate the fact that we are born again. We get to be saved. We are like Christ because we are his righteousness, right? Or it could include many other wonderful details that we'll realize in heaven. And see, the idea of theosis is just, it's hard to really narrow in on details about it. In what sense do we become like God? Now, I like the distinction that you described. I think that would be a good distinction to make. Now, what does it mean that we become like his energies? What does that include, right? What is that?
That is the question that is very hard to answer. But I will tell you, okay, and I'll say that there's been, I mean, this has obviously been written on for like thousands of years now. Like the early church fathers did mention this a lot. But again, the word pertain, where it says to pertain to life and godliness, is kind of an important distinction, because I think that it could obviously pertain to the whole like born again through Christ thing. But I think the wording here is explicit enough to where I might think otherwise. And what it's not like, it's kind of hard to, because it's like a complicated thing. Like it's not very easy to wrap your head around. But I know that John of Damascus was the one who first made the distinction between essence and energies. But
by the way, welcome, big boy Chakalaka. Welcome to the study. I appreciate you showing up. What a time to show up. We're talking about theosis, but thanks for coming by.
Yeah. So basically, we become partakers in the divine nature, and there is the nature distinction is also important, because it does not mean that God's nature, it doesn't mean we become divine by nature, if that makes sense. Like
of course not.
Our nature is not going to be, obviously, okay? But it does mean...
What's up, King Clashers? I hope you enjoyed. Sorry.
We participate in God's energies described by a number of terms. Yeah, number of terms in Scripture. So this is what it is. Okay, Glory, life, love, virtue, and power. Okay,
I would agree.
We are to become like God by His grace, and truly, be His adopted children, if that makes sense. But never become God by nature. And some church fathers say that this especially occurs through the Eucharist, and then there's some like real presence stuff that you gotta believe there. But still. Craziness. That's the justification for the doctrine is definitely there. I think there's definitely like interpretations, but I haven't seen it accurately refuted before.
I don't know. Well, I don't know why is this something that should be refuted? I mean, it seems to me that when Jesus... I
don't know if it's something you can disagree with. I just think it's a more explicit interpretation of what a lot of Christians already believe.
Yeah. I think it's trying to apply details to these words. I think that the things you listed off, what'd you say, glory, life, love, I don't know, you seem to have it ready.
Power, some other things, yeah.
Power, careful with power. We won't be omnipotent.
Power's an odd one, okay? But again, it is in God's energies. It's not saying that we can become like God, because we can't have omnipotence, because omnipotence is that infinite power. Like it is the complete power. That's why it's an eternal process. Like if you think about even, okay, I don't know how much you do engineering, so I assume you know a good bit of math. Okay, if you think about like the end behavior,
I know a couple things
of something that's approaching a point. Like so, it's like the end behavior of something that is approaching, like let's just say like 2.
Oh yeah, like an asymptote.
It will never necessarily like always get there. It'll just like asymptote at that value. So that's the idea, is that it's like it's not we cannot be completely like God. That's why it's an infinite process. And that's why it's like, otherwise the goal would be, like there isn't, the end goal is to be like God, but then it's not like, we could never have the full power of God because we cannot ever reach the end of theosis.
Yeah, I think, do I want to look at it asymptotically? That's because you get pretty close after a while. Then I don't know. Here's what I do know. We are human beings. We are creations, which means that we will not, of course, reach godhood. We can't. But I will point out that like when we enter into heaven, we will receive glorified bodies, right? We will receive a new physical and a nature to accompany our spiritual nature. Now, our spiritual nature is not divinity. right? We're not Joyce Myers and her little gods theory. I'm sorry, that's a deep cut. But it's not divinity. It's glorification. It partakes in divinity, meaning that when I read that, I simply understand whatever characteristics or identities or energies or whatever you want to define it as, God wills to give to us and can or decides to or is able to or whatever you want to phrase it as, those are the ones that we will have. Whatever he does not will to give to us or that we can't assume just because we aren't divinity itself, then we will not have. To what degree that means power? It's not zero. We're obviously going to have more power in heaven than we do on earth in these sinful, corrupted bodies. That's not even a question. Okay? I mean, if Jerusalem City, as I read tonight, is truly 1,500 miles by 1,500 miles by 1,500 miles, we better be able to move faster. Right. So, I mean, there's going to be a sense of power and ability that is way beyond what we have right now. But to what degree do we assume God's power? Well, if by God's power, you're going to identify his authoritative nature to carry out things that he wills in a libertarian free way, we will definitely not have that. We will not be able to have authority in the way God does, though we are given authority over the nations, according to Revelation, letters to the churches. And we will not have this libertarian free will, as in that we are free completely the way God is free. We do have free will, but it's free will according to our nature. So I think those things have to be factored in if you talk about power. But of course, then there is a degree in which we'll have power. Is a degree we'll have more love. We'll have more, I don't know how important grace will be in heaven, except for the fact that we know God gave it. But things like that, those attributes of God, of course, we'll have more of. It's just, we can't be dogmatic about the level in which that partaking of the divine nature can actually be experienced.
Right. Okay, I agree.
Yeah. What was the other passage, just so I can read it after Peter?
I think it's First John, where it's talking about being like Christ.
First John.
I think that might be. I mean, there's none that are better. I think it's first. Let me find it. Actually,
Go ahead.
Lost it. I'll know where it is.
I trust in your findingness. Timnick always knows how to just bring the profound topics. The wonderful topics.
Go. It is somewhere in here. So I'm going to find it. Oh, and I've gone too far already.
Oh, look, Gabe's finally back.
Okay, yeah. 1 John chapter 3. Let's go, verse 2.
Beloved, we are God's children now, and what we will be has not yet appeared, but we will know when he appears. We shall be like him, because we shall see him as he is. Did I not just quote this? Did I quote this? Maybe in a different context? Yeah. It's when I was talking about being like Christ. Yeah, we will be like Christ. We will be like him because we see him as he is. Again, to what sense that will be, I believe in this particular passage, it's referring to his righteousness. And everyone who, verse 3, and everyone who thus hopes in him purifies himself as he is pure. What's pure? What's pure in heart in Matthew 5, right? This is a heart that is holy. We will have his holiness, will we not? We won't ever have the eternal holiness of God, because we are not eternal nor eternally holy. But we will have the complete perfection of righteousness in heaven, will we not? Right? So that is a sense in which we will become like God. Now, I would argue, now that we're here, I would argue that the most core way that we can become like God and partake in his nature is be holy. That's the most core way that we can do it.
Right, but then that also begs the question of is then the purpose of Christian life just to become more virtuous and holy, to have just is the end goal to do that in the goal, in the end of is the end salvation, or is there is it just be more virtuous until you're saved, or like what is the goal there?
Well, that's the idea of justification and sanctification. So the idea there is simply this: at the moment that I put in genuine faith in Christ, I am saved, justified transactionally before the Father as having sacrificed for sin. Okay, that's salvation in the transactional sense. That's delineated in Romans. That's talked about how when the Bible speaks of penal substitution, which is the idea that Christ paid a sin debt. That's discussed in the parable of the one who was forgiven 10,000 talents and then went out and didn't forgive and over 1 denarii, right? That's the idea there, penal substitution, right? But there's also a sense in which when I am saved, I am justified before God right now. I believe God. And when I then have to now live the rest of my life, and I'm not obviously perfect because I have my flesh, and obviously Paul talks a lot about fighting the flesh and that he recognizes himself as the chief of sinners, and he does the things he doesn't want to do, but doesn't do the things he wants to do, and he talks about the battle with sin. That's the way in which we as a Christian life strive to be holy. Why? Because the nature of the believer, the very nature of the believer is that he wants to be like Christ. The nature of the believer is not that they signed a line or said a word saying, okay, I accept Christ's sacrifice. No, the nature of the believer is that he denies himself and picks up his cross and follows after Christ. And when Jesus says this to the disciples, he says it to all of his followers, the servant is satisfied with being like his master. He doesn't want to be greater than his master. He wants to simply be like his master. He wants to be as good as his master. This is the nature of a true Christian. The reason that we talk about works and faith is because faith is the intangible thing that we cannot see. It's in, what is the word I used earlier? In regards to the kingdom, I liked that word. It's imperceptible. Imperceptible, right? That's why we have James telling us, if you say you have faith and you have not works, then you are not a true believer in essence, right? Even the demons believe and they shudder, right? So, like, the works are the evidence of faith, and the true saving faith, which is transactionally happening immediately and kept by God according to Romans 8 by his power, that true saving faith is going to manifest in the evidential works. And the true believer who's denying themselves and wants to follow Jesus, and like Jesus says, if you love me, you'll obey my commandments, you doing those works will strive to want to do greater works and more of them. Why? Because you actually love Christ. And if you truly love Christ, why would you not want to be like him? Why would you not pursue holiness in all ways that you can pursue holiness? That's who Christ is. You want to be like him because you actually know him. All right, and that's true saving faith. It has a transactional justification side, but that's in the sense where your sin is forgiven. In the sense of you being a follower and a lover of Christ, your heart is going to want to strive to be like him and to forsake the things of this world, let them grow dim because they are evil and they destroy, and you realize what true life is. You realize where the fountain of life is opened, and so you follow Christ with all your heart's desire, right? Salvation is at the core and nature of desire. It's not a function of intellect. It's not a function of transaction. It's just there's a transactional aspect in which you in front of God are justified because Jesus, in you realizing his beauty and following after him to be like him, not only is a wise counselor and a wonderful whatever, he is also the sacrifice for sin. Right. So that's, and again, in James, I think you see that dichotomy or the juxtaposition, or whatever word you want to use, the pairing of the works and faith really well together.
Right.
Does that follow for you?
Yeah.
Cool.
I think that's all I have time for. And at some point, I do want to discuss penal substitution.
Oh.
So it's definitely not a doctrine I subscribe to.
Interesting. That's one, as I told Crafting, I'll argue that one till my death, because if that is not true, then we are wasting our time right now. Wasting it. This is a wasted hour if Jesus is not the paid sacrifice for sin, if he's not the sin debt coverer. It's a waste of time.
Right. But I'll get things on that, because like that, sure. I do not like I do remember seeing something on it and agreeing against it, but I will have to look at it. But for now, I gotta go. So
I am more likely we'll wrap up right now. I am more likely to argue vehemently for penal substitution than even for Reformed theology, like Calvinism. Like that, it's just that is a non-negotiable for me. So I will, in the strongest way possible, try to convince you of what the Bible clearly teaches about Christ's sacrifice. But anyway, that's for another time. Thank you for saying everything you said, Tunic. It's always very, very interesting to me.
Yeah, thanks for the study. It's very interesting.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm glad everybody who came, and I hope you guys enjoyed. Thank you, Gabe, for undeafening for the final 5 minutes. No, I'm just messing. Yeah. Next week we'll catch. We'll continue. All right.